Welcome to REBsessions. I'm going to be doing a rating of all 6 of the Arctic Monkeys' original studio albums. So the Arctic Monkeys started out as Alex, Matt, and Andy Nicholson, who was the original bass player of the Arctic Monkeys. They formed the band in 2002, and then a little bit later on added Jamie into the mix. So then they played their first gig at a place called the Grapes in Sheffield, and after a few performances, they ended up recording their demos and then just burning them on CDs, giving them away to people. So then obviously people would file share this like crazy, which is partially why, besides MySpace, which wasn't even their official MySpace, that they could be considered a band that really got famous through the internet first. So eventually after that, they made it onto BBC Radio and in the tabloids. And a local photographer made a video for Fake Tales of San Francisco, put it on his website along with their demos. So then in 2005, they released their first singles on their own label, which obviously had limited distribution, but could also be downloaded on iTunes. Soon after that, they played a festival that featured lesser known bands and unsigned bands, and they got a ton of exposure for that. And then in the summer of 2005, they were signed with Domino, and the rest is downhill from there. So with this rating, first of all, this was an extremely difficult rating to do. I had to kind of give myself a few parameters to look for to narrow things down a little bit so that I could set them off from each other. So here are the things that I think make Arctic Monkeys so good. 1, Alex Turner's lyrics. He is a clever boy. His phrasing and also his phrases, his storytelling, his unique way of putting things. It's all just mesmerizingly good. Then 2, they're a very riffy band. One of the things about this band is that they're very good at taking an idea and stretching it about as far as you possibly can. And I mean this with guitar riffs and bass riffs. They're catchy, they're groovy. Then there's Matt Helder's drums, which it's a big deal to me that these are drums that I actually want to listen to as an instrument and not just feel. Then vibe and energy. They do know how to set a tone. And then lastly, synthesis, so incorporating different ideas from different sources, bringing them together, and then ultimately that gives the album diversity, besides that being a standalone trait. So let's just say this was a really hard rating for me to do. Okay, album number 1. Whatever people say I am, that's what I'm not. Came out in 2006, was recorded in Lincolnshire. This album was and is the fastest selling debut album in British music history, shifting over 360,000 copies in the first week. Flippin' amazing. And this album is all about like experiences and people watching of the clubbing nightlife scene of an 18-year-old. And the album was named the way it was to sort of resemble this British novel called Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, which is pretty much the same theme throughout it as this album, except for it's in like the 1950s. And this album is where you really hear their shuffled accent coming through, which is completely right in line with the tone of the album. It's right that it's that way. And I think that's partially what made them so beloved, kind of like a hometown heroes bit of thing. But it's also largely because of the poet John Cooper Clarke. So he was a performance poet from Lancashire, famous in the 1970s as a punk poet, and obviously somebody that Alex Turner was really into, as evidenced by their cover of I Wanna Be Yours, which the original I linked below if you want to hear it. And you'll probably notice that Alex's accent kind of phases out as the albums go on. And I think part of this is a style thing. The albums didn't necessarily call for that as time went on as much. You can still always hear it, but also he probably started to learn how to actually sing. And when you do that, I mean, that changes your accent anyways. But then he started living in other places besides where he grew up. So it's harder for some people than others to keep their accent when they do that. So as far as a rating goes for this album, I loved 85% of this album. The lyrics and the phrasing, I mean, he could ram words in a phrase in a way that's actually really hard to make flow, especially with the amount of words. Besides that, how he unfolds a story. I mean, he shows, he doesn't tell, which is like a basic skill that good lyricists should have, but he just does it so right. And you see little glimmers of how clever he is with this, but you don't necessarily get the idea that he's sitting there trying to outwit himself. Riffs, songs that are hooky and get stuck in your head, I think that's just a hallmark of the Arctic Monkeys that they've established from the very start. And then the vibe and the energy of this album. I think you could arguably call this a concept album. It kind of all revolves around the same thing, and it's definitely kind of garage bandy, but the fact that it is that and they pull it off and I like it is definitely an accomplishment, because I don't usually go for that very much. But really, the fact that this is a debut album and so much of the album is listenable and just really good, I have to give it an A. Okay, their second album, Favorite Worst Nightmare, came out in 2007, was recorded in London and Liverpool, and entered the scene Nick O'Malley and then also Miles Kane on 505. And speaking of 505, this just shows a little reoccurring theme here of Alex movie geekery, because the organ at the beginning of that song is supposed to be reminiscent of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, in that part where, you know, Angel Eyes enters the scene right before the final standoff. So I personally liked about 75% of this album. With the lyrics, this is definitely where you start to see Alex's wit come through. On top of that, just great imagery, creative phrasing, wonderful. The riffs, good, catchy as ever, groovy as heck. Their vibe and their energy. This is such like a punk 21-year-old kid kind of a thing. It's like you still have the attitude of a teenager, but like you actually got experiences under your belt to kind of warrant that. The drums, dancey drums. I love dancey drums. And then diversity. This is a lot less garage rocky and a lot more of this like gutsy, clear voice. But then they also incorporated a little bit more of an emotional energy into there. So I think it also has very good diversity. So with that, I would definitely give this album a B, which is weird because in comparison to the last one, I think that the individual songs are possibly better than the ones from before, but that album as a whole is really excellent. So this was actually really hard to even put them at different places, especially despite the fact that I liked more of the last album all around, but I like less of this album more than that. Third, Humbug. Came out in 2009, and this is where they started recording in the United States. This was done in Burbank, also Joshua Tree, California, and then a little bit in Brooklyn, New York. And entered the scene Josh Homme, which is really what I would attribute the overall darker vibe of this album to, because, I mean, I think it's easy to believe that, oh, you know, they're in California, they're gonna have this brighter kind of California sound. Or maybe just I would think that, I don't know. But really, what they got was the Josh Homme sound, regardless of the fact that he was not at all imposing in their creative process, but it's just inescapably a little bit Queens of the Stone Age, dark and groovy. And really, it's so impossible to separate a band's sound from the space that they have to work in. And there's an article below that tells a lot more in detail about it, but really they were working in a lot more challenging conditions. Sparser conditions, not having everything you need at your disposal, which is good for you. Less outside distractions, their neighbors were half a mile away, there was nothing to do except for record and shoot stuff. Less familiar equipment. All of those things I think really contributed immensely to their growth as a band, and you can definitely feel the growing pains in this album. One other cool thing about this album is that they really started to throw some more different instruments in there, like baritone and slide guitars, lots of different great effects, xylophones, glockenspiels, shakers, and along with that, more keyboards. Especially the keyboards. This is the beginning of their sound really shifting, becoming a little more complex and production oriented. So I liked personally 60% of this album. I think the lyrics are definitely the highlight of this album. I sort of wonder what this album would have been like if they would have kept some of the songs that Josh Homme liked, but that didn't make the album. The riffs, they're certainly there, like in Dangerous Animals and Crying Lightning, along with some fantastic drummage. I love the Crying Lightning drums. But this album really is, when you come down to it, a little bit more like Tar than Black Treacle. And it's honestly just a case of them trying to grow and move forward. And I think because of that, I could give it a B, but I'm gonna give it a C. And I mean that with the most respect and endearment that I possibly can, because I actually think for all of those reasons, it's a fantastic album. But it's just really hard to not throw everything into A and B. So fourth, Suck It and See, came out in 2011. First of all, let's just talk about what the album title means. It means you don't know till you try. You have to try it first. So this album was recorded in LA at the Sound City studio, which if you have never seen Dave Grohl's documentary on Sound City, I highly recommend it. And this just goes to show that you can hang out with Josh Homme all you want, but if you stay in LA too long, you're gonna catch the sunshine. This album is said to be where the band focused a lot more of their time on rehearsing written songs, and so then when they would do that, then they would stumble upon different ideas in the process. I liked, personally, 75% of this album. It's less riffy as a general rule, maybe a little bit more melodic or focusing on arpeggiated things. And with lyrics, there's definitely some smile lines in there. She's Thunderstorms is an incredibly clever song, unique as ever. It reminds me of Nowhere Man by the Beatles for some reason. Somebody tell me why that is. I am dying to know. And not just unique lines, but unique lines that you could hold on to. Like, called up to listen to the voice of reason and got the answering machine. Or, that's not a skirt girl, that's a sawn-off shotgun, and I can only hope you got it aimed at me. Like, who thinks of this? I mean, the lyrical imagery of this album is excellent. Then there's, okay, but also side point. There is a little part at the beginning of Library Pictures where it's just the band like screwing around, and definitely sounds like Putting on the Ritz. Tell me it's not. Also, I think this album does actually have some pretty good diversity. And then as far as drums go, there's some sweet, like Blondie-esque a la Dreams drums in the last track. And then some of my favorite drums on the whole planet Earth are in She's Thunderstorms. All right, you all are gonna kill me. You're gonna roast me on a spit. But the next one is Tranquility Base, Hotel and Casino, which came out in 2018. Definitely a concept album, which means you think that I would love it. It was produced in Paris, LA, and London by Alex Turner and then James Ford, who had pretty much been part of the production process of these guys since the beginning. So what this album looks like on the surface to a casual consumer, maybe, is the love child of Frank Sinatra and David Bowie after snorting coke out of the folds of Dune. Intellectually, theoretically, on paper, this is all brilliant. Like, we know Alex Turner is brilliant, and no, he's not the only one in the band, but this was pretty obviously his baby. It's honestly like what he was going for was writing this satirical, political, social commentary, science fiction novel in album form, which sounds pretty cool, actually. Being different characters' perspectives, incorporating his movie geekery, and just like really exploring any kinds of artistic or creative potential that had kind of seemed on the surface to be untapped before. And I think the best thing that he did in all of this is the way that he would play the different characters by using different vocal techniques. And this is me being harsh, but I think this is a prime example of a sort of self-indulgent artist phase, where enduring the consequence of being and expressing themselves is actually a lighter sentence than the alternative. Not. And I truly just think it's a case of him being bored and not wanting to do things that felt predictable to him. And so this is what happens. It's like everything you've done so far has not failed, so you can kind of afford to take one on the chin and just do something, try something for the sake of doing what you want to do. And he obviously wanted to do something very different, hence abandoning the conventional chord progressions, song structures, and just anything that didn't hit the spot for him anymore. End theory rant. So basically, I'm an uncultured swine, and I can compare it to the culinary industry in this way to sum it up. when chefs are at such a high technical level, creatively, that they need to experiment to this degree in order to satisfy their imagination. And that's wonderful. And the food is probably brilliant and beautiful. But at the end of the day, most people's horizons stop at upscale comfort food. Give someone foie gras and consommé encapsulated in a sous vide venison tube with herb foam, or give somebody some mac and cheese al dente with a few different nice cheeses made with an IPA, some nice broiled breadcrumbs, and like crunchy, cheesy broiled bits. Tell me which one they're gonna pick. There's no debate about what's more inventive or took more skill, but what's yummy and makes you make all the good noises. So on that basis, despite myself, I feel pretty comfortable giving this album a D. And yes, I'm secretly hoping Alex Turner doesn't watch this and I don't hurt his feelings because he cares what I think. Okay, last but not least is AM, which came out in 2013. And I loved 83% of this album. Very weird. This was recorded in LA in Joshua Tree, and I definitely think that this album sounds like LA, which isn't necessarily something that you can fully relate, but if you think of all of the LA bands that you can, then just think of the average sound that they achieve. It's a lot like this, which this is taking into consideration the slicker production of the album, a bit more of the hip hop influence, and just like, if you've ever been to LA, this is exactly what that place sounds like at night. And this is the album that put the Arctic Monkeys on the map in the US. And I think that makes sense. Like, they'd caught the vibe of the place, but with a little bit of that British romanticism that you just don't get with the other stuff that was going on at the time. And Do I Want to Know is their first song to chart on the Billboard Hot 100. And then the album as a whole eventually pretty quickly after that went platinum here. And so if you dissect the song, it's pretty safe to say that it was the things that I described earlier, but mostly it's that beat heavy thing that just pounds in your head, and that's what really got him. LA loves their subwoofers. And I think it's easy to see here that they were putting more emphasis on creating a solid studio album, and as usual incorporating more instruments as they do piano, organ, Hohner guitarette, and a vintage drum machine. And so, to quote Alex Turner, and then to paraphrase Alex Turner, which made me really smile, he said, "It's like a Dr. Dre beat, but we've given it an Ike Turner bowl cut and sent it galloping across the desert on a Stratocaster." That is exactly the vibe of this album. And it's a lot less like four lads playing in a room. Even though that's what it is, but if you can find a way to manipulate the sound to the point where it sounds boss in your car, then there's something cool about that. And that right there is what Americans were ready to latch onto. And I think that this album really is where everything that always made the Arctic Monkeys good, all the things that they were trying to incorporate, to work on, to grow, along with excellent production, that's where all these things converge. And I think there's a certain youth maybe that has been lost when you hear it, especially in comparison to before, but I mean, we kind of gotta hear these guys grow up through their albums. So not only would I give this album an A, but it is also my personal favorite, and here's why. The song Are You Mine is really the song that made me pay attention to the Arctic Monkeys. And it's really only because I had this silly Rocksmith game to make me practice my guitar, which was actually really fun, but kind of a piece of crap. Anyways, it's funny because it's like me and this band were like ships passing in the night for years. I just never gave them the time of day. I even had somebody dedicate the song Do I Want to Know to me, like around about the same time. And it really took Are You Mine to just pin me down and make me listen. And after that, I went and watched a couple of their concerts on YouTube, and I've basically been addicted to this band ever since. So that was my rating. You probably disagree with me. I mean, I disagree with me. So go ahead and tell me in the comments what you think the rating should be. Also, make sure to hit like, subscribe, click the notification bell, and most importantly, join me again on REBsessions.